Jubilee middle ground, trans versus conservative women. So let's see if we can find some common middle ground between transes and conservatives.
Step forward if you agree. The transgender movement is indoctrinating our youth.
3 for 3, woo! Oh no.
We are seeing, especially on social media, on TikTok, you're seeing a lot of people in this community really just targeting children, and you're seeing drag shows, even in conservative states like Texas, and even just media, movies, like it seems like everything seems to be targeted at these kids. You have drag story hour for kids.
Drag is not about trans people. Like drag is about like gender nonconformity and like a different gender expression. But I think that kind of the key distinction here is the term indoctrinating. All she's talking about right now is exposure to trans people and to gender nonconformity, which I would certainly agree that, yeah, people in general are being more so exposed to trans people. That's something you're going to see if any group becomes more socially normalized, more socially accepted. Like we started seeing more people coming out as gay when we stopped bullying gay people as much. Does that mean that we were being indoctrinated by gay people, or just that we were being exposed to gay people more? So there's a big difference between exposure and indoctrination, but I'll see if she goes further to make the gap between exposure and indoctrination.
It's just really, I think, predatory in a way, and I'm not saying every trans person is doing this, but as a whole, there does seem to be a route that they're taking to get to the kids.
When you hear Blues Clues playing in the next room, and then you hear the gay parade song, it's Blues Clues, you're not expecting to be talking to the children about that. Yeah. It really makes you wonder, are they really coming for the children?
Once again, they've all just been talking about exposure to trans people, to gender nonconformity. They haven't been talking about indoctrination. Are these shows or whatever that they're talking about telling people you are transgender, be transgender? Or they're just like, hey, trans people exist? Because I'm pretty sure it's the second one. Like, that seems to be what all this exposure is about. It's more so, trans people exist, gender nonconformity exists. And I think that the idea of normalizing the fact that there is a diverse body of humans out there and that you should accept and love people, regardless of all the different shapes and sizes and whatnots they come in, that's a good thing to do. It's not saying you are transgender, but rather you're going to live in a world where transgender people exist, and hey, that's okay.
In our population now, the rate of young children who are identifying as transgender, non-binary is skyrocketing. And I think there's something to be said for people who are truly experiencing gender dysphoria, which we recognize exists, and those who are experiencing what is now going to be called, or in the future going to be called, this social contagion gender dysphoria.
Oh no. This is going to be an interesting panel because this is Amala, for those who don't know, who has like media and rhetoric training. And so she is going to be very different in kind of like the way she talks about these issues compared to the other people, simply because she has a media training to know how to direct things. Notice how, in talking about indoctrination, she didn't describe any kind of processes that would like indoctrinate people into being trans. What she did was she immediately went for, there are more people identifying as trans, to say the cause is indoctrination. But that's not the way that like a correlation works. The truth is that as social acceptance improves, more people are going to be able to comfortably be themselves. It's that graph of left-handedness. As being left-handed became more and more socially acceptable, we saw people identifying as left-handed at greater and greater rates. But then it plateaued. And if you look at the rate of LGBTQ identification, this exact same kind of trend is happening, but we're going to be approaching that level where it plateaus. And that's just the general trend of these kind of social acceptance movements. And then Amala brought up the social contagion theory, which is the worst study I have ever seen. And anybody who cites this study should be laughed at. The rapid onset gender dysphoria social contagion study. The way that they conducted the study was they surveyed transphobic parents, not trans kids themselves, they just surveyed transphobic parents whom they recruited from websites such as transgendertrend.com. What they did was they asked, hey, transphobic parents who frequently visit transgendertrend.com, do you think that being trans is part of a social contagion? And the transphobic parents were like, yes. And then they published this research saying, look, parents believe this, therefore it's true. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to assess if there is an element of social contagion in trans people, but the way that you should do that is you should analyze trans people. You should find out what caused these trans people themselves to identify as trans. Is being trans actually right for them? Like, what caused them to realize they were trans? You need to survey the population you're actually trying to study, not their disapproving parents. That is the worst group you could ask because they are heavily biased, and they're just going to tell you exactly what you want to hear if you want to hear that trans people are bad. I mean, anybody who cites a study should just be completely laughed at. You have a single author who is just trying to publish her own political goals. That's literally the entire point of the study. This study is garbage. They even had to put like a little correction statement on the screen because she cited the rapid onset gender dysphoria paper. The quote they have right here is, after intense debate and criticism, PLOS One issued a correction that they did not survey transgender or gender diverse youth themselves, but actually surveyed their parents. Rapid onset gender dysphoria is not a formal mental health diagnosis at this time. They literally have to have a little correction statement right here because of how she's able to deceptively slide in point after point after point.
And children are now starting to develop gender confusion.
Or even babies, right? People who are being born, they don't have to put the gender on the birth certificate, and they're saying you can choose whatever you want to be. Like, that's so dangerous.
Wait, what's the danger of gender neutral parenting? From what I've seen with the studies on gender neutral parenting is that the kids turn out just as fine, if not better, when they're parented in a gender neutral environment. So I would love to see her like actually justify any kind of harms of gender neutral parenting. I don't think she can, and that's why she's moving on.
Put you on hormone blockers at this age, it won't do anything to your puberty, it won't affect you long term. And it's just a straight up lie. And there's like an entire Reddit thread dedicated to people who've transitioned, talking about how much they hate their life now because they transitioned as a child and now they amputated off healthy body parts. And
we are jumping all over the place. So first off, puberty blockers, they absolutely do affect your puberty, because they put a pause on it. Everybody knows that taking puberty blockers is going to pause your puberty. As far as long-term effects, there is not anything which is of concern. There were some things people talked about IQ differences, but that just is caused by the abnormal development pattern of somebody who undergoes puberty blockers, and after stopping the puberty blockers, they return right back to where the other kids are. So that concern completely goes away after the medicine stopped. As far as bone density is the other one that people talk about, that tends to also go pretty much right back to the rest of the general population as soon as it stopped. We have a long-term cohort of kids that had precocious puberty that went on puberty blockers. Their bone density was in like the 40th percentile of people, which is not concerning at all. That's just like slightly lower than average. And so if we're talking about detransitioners, that's actually the point of the puberty blockers, is that they can detransition off the puberty blockers, and then there won't be anything irreversible that's happened to their body. Now, if you're talking about people that have had surgeries and hormones, yeah, obviously those things are, actually lots of things of hormones are reversible, some aren't, and then surgeries, obviously those would not be reversible without like future surgery. But in general, there is so much screening that goes on to providing surgery, even for trans adults. I mean, the WPATH standard requires multiple therapist letters, even for adults, to receive certain forms of gender-affirming surgery. It is a lengthy process. I mean, you have wait lists of literal years to get a consultation for bottom surgery, let alone the surgery itself. Like, it is so hard to get these surgeries, and every surgery is going to have some kind of regret rate. LASIK eye surgery has a regret rate of about 4%. Knee replacement surgery has a regret rate of about 20%. Bottom surgery for trans people, we have a 50-year longitudinal study which found only a 2% regret rate. The regret rate for trans surgeries is far less than the regret rates of most surgeries. I think it's about the average for elective surgeries to have a regret rate of about 5%. For trans surgeries, the regret rate is 1 to 2% depending on the surgery, like much less than the regret rate of any other elective surgery. But you don't see people fear-mongering about, I had LASIK eye surgery, I didn't like it, my body's ruined forever. It seems that people are a lot more keen to weaponize this against trans people.
All right. Can the disagreeer step forward?
The fact that the trans movement has got people shook has me so excited. The trans movement is not indoctrinating our youth. Our youth are understanding who they are at a younger age. And from what I was hearing over here is, a lot of what y'all were saying, I wonder would you say it to the parents? Because we need to really look at what the parents of trans youth really go through. Trans youth, instead of them enjoying their life, playing with their friends, they're up in legislation trying to fight for basic rights here. 1 in 5 transgender youth have tried to commit suicide. Why are we trying to police them?
But you're bringing it only to the parents. The question was indoctrination in general. Am I correct? And then,
But they are part of that conversation. Someone said something about drag shows coming to schools or whatnot. The kids enjoyed it. The parents just had a problem with it. But that's their issue. It's only someone dressed in drag reading a story.
I don't really like going down the direction of drag here. Probably the better thing to be is like, I have no clue why you're talking about drag. That's just an expression of gender nonconformity. That has nothing to do with trans people. People are not being told, you are transgender, be transgender, you have to be transgender. This idea of indoctrination is completely unfounded. And then going back to the left-hand example, I think that's stronger than trying to get caught up into the drag conversation.
Is
That could have
drag
been
not
anybody.
blackface for women? I see it as a caricature of womanhood.
But inherently
It's
sexual as
insulting.
well.
Hold up, is gender nonconformity like blackface? Being like a tomboy, is that like blackface? Absolutely not. The purpose of blackface was to mock, to shame, and to degrade. Gender nonconformity has none of those purposes. And then the comment that drag is inherently sexual, there are certainly sexual contexts where drag is performed, and there are also certainly non-sexual contexts where drag is performed. It's like theater or movies can be sexual. They can also be completely non-sexual. Same is true about drag. It's just a different kind of performance art. People just kind of have this intrinsic notion of it being weird because it's queer-coded. It just has much more so to do with general queer phobia than anything else.
I do not like the drag queen social hours. I personally, as a trans person, didn't ever go to a drag show until I was about 40. I'm not for the sexualization of kids. Why are we not letting kids be kids and bringing sex into their lives so early?
See, this is the problem with getting into the drag queen conversation. Like, you're just gonna get caught up on having to debunk so many just like talking points and kind of like general societal notions that are completely untrue. It's completely beside the point because drag queens and trans people are not the same thing. It's not what we're even talking about.
Who's teaching sex to third grade children? I really want to know.
Have you looked at the California curriculum for sex education? You need to.
I know that when I was in preschool, I got my first crush on a boy because to me at the time, he was in kindergarten, he looked like Prince Eric from
Little Mermaid.
Yeah, Little Mermaid. I don't think like fucking him ever crossed my mind when I was 4, but obviously like it would have been good to know that like it's okay, like if you have these feelings for someone of the same sex.
When we think of youth in general, they're having sex at a lot younger age, whether we like it or not. Let's just keep it 100%
You don't think it's
real.
because of that?
Actually, we have empirical data which shows the opposite. When you teach comprehensive sex education, teens are less likely to have sex than those who are taught abstinence only, than those who are not taught sex education at all. If you have comprehensive sex education, you are empirically, measurably, quantifiably less likely to have sex.
Either you teach your children or the world is going to teach your kids. That's the reality of it.
They are learning about it at younger ages from some adult or even their peers who learned about it from adults.
It is also true with lots of different things. Either you teach your kids about it or they're going to learn it from peers, from the internet, from perhaps a lot more questionable sources. You can make similar arguments with illegal substances, with dangerous acts. I think that it's important to educate people on the safety of these topics. And it shows that they're actually less likely to engage in dangerous behaviors when you educate them about it. Wow, science rules.
As a mother and seeing what my children are going to have to be introduced to at such a young age, like I didn't even know what a gay person was till I was like 12. And so they're going to be having these really heavy adult conversations at a really young age just because of their exposure. And that is honestly just scary.
Does she think the existence of gay people is inherently an adult conversation? Ariel has a crush on Prince Eric. People are completely fine with it. But if it was Princess Erica, then the conservatives go crazy about it. There's nothing sexual about that crush, especially in the way it's depicted to children. It's just if you change the gender of them, conservatives are going to act very differently about the situation. That's kind of the key problem there. We can recognize that you can have these crushes and that there's nothing sexual, especially at a young age. It's often much more so kind of like a platonic desire than anything else. But as soon as you make it about somebody that's the same gender, conservatives now think it's sexual. But if that were the case, wouldn't it also be sexual in the straight case? Wouldn't that mean that, like, The Little Mermaid is indoctrinating kids into being straight? It's not. The argument just doesn't work.
don't want to have those conversations. That's why I will be homeschooling my kids, because I do believe it is my responsibility to protect them and shield them from the outside world, which is targeting children.
I really wish I could ask her, do you think it's like indoctrinating your kid into being straight if they like watch The Little Mermaid and they see Ariel have a crush on Prince Eric? That's the question that she needs to be asked to like think about this further.
The trans movement is really shaking the course of what people think gender identity is supposed to be.
So in one sentence, you're saying that you guys are not responsible for the indoctrination that's currently happening with
Absolutely
children.
not.
And in the second sentence, you are saying we are shook by the fact that you are responsible for it.
No, you are shook at the fact that the trans movement has become what it is.
And a movement that influences people all
powerful-
over the world, and particularly children. And we see it in the fact that the number of young people identifying as transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, genderqueer is skyrocketing, which
Once again, Amala's only point is that there are more people identifying as trans. She has not made the link to indoctrination causing this. She's just pointing out that more people are trans. Were left-handed people being indoctrinated into being left-handed in the 40s and the 60s? No, they were just able to safely come out as being left-handed. That's not indoctrination. That's just being able to safely come out as who you are.
children are being exposed to these ideas, and it's certainly coming from institutions like the media, like Hollywood, like our public institutions and schools. So to say that that is not happening, or to deny that that is the reality, negates the numbers that we're seeing.
She also just conflated exposure and indoctrination, like all of the conservative women have been doing in this entire panel.
What I would say is that the idea that there is a single transgender movement and ideology is disingenuous, and that at its core, being transgender is about separating sex from sex roles and gender roles that are compulsory.
Do you think that children should be able to transition medically?
No,
I think
no.
it just really depends on each individual situation. They should be able to make the best medical decision for them.
The way that Amala asked that question was very loaded. Like when you say, do you think that kids should medically transition? Well, how young are we talking? Because if somebody hasn't even started puberty yet, there is no reason why they would ever even want to go through any kind of like medical procedure. But if we're talking about like a teenager, then I think that with, you know, informed consent with doctors and therapist letters, that we have processes in place that can identify which benefit from a medical transition. And I think that that should be between the doctors and the kid and their parents. And, you know, let's just let the medicine perform the best medicine, the most personalized medicine that can do the most good for people. And we have studies which back this up. We have medical guidelines which back this up.
I am comfortable sharing bathrooms with the other side.
Yes, I feel comfortable. Safe, that might be a different question, but comfortable, yes, I feel comfortable.
We can dispel the safety myth, by the way. We actually have empirical data on this. Once states enacted policies allowing trans people to use bathrooms of the gender they identified, there is no empirical increase in any kind of assaults or privacy violations. In the empirical data, there is no harm to cis people by allowing trans people into the bathroom that corresponds with their identity. However, we do have empirical evidence which shows that when trans people are forced into the bathroom of the sex they were assigned at birth, at that point, the trans people are harmed at extremely disproportionate rates. So it's actually the trans people need to be worried if they're forced in the bathrooms corresponding to the gender they were assigned at birth. That's just where the factual empirical data is at.
An issue of predatory men taking advantage of the opening, that now they could walk into a women's bathroom.
Well, hold up. That has nothing to do with the question at all. The question is, are you, as a conservative woman, comfortable sharing bathrooms with a trans woman? If you're talking about the predatory man, that's already illegal. Accepting trans people doesn't open up that door any more than it already exists. A predatory man can just walk into a woman's bathroom and be predatory. Like, he doesn't have to put on a dress and change his name and pronouns to go into the women's bathroom. We don't have armed guards at women's bathrooms that are checking people's driver's license or something before they go into the bathroom. Like, that's just not how this works. This doesn't open up the door to predatory behavior in any way. And if it did, you would expect to see an empirical increase in the assault and privacy violations that would happen in bathrooms. But there is no increase in the assaults and privacy violations in bathrooms when these trans-inclusive policies are adopted.
A women's locker room, as we've seen happen in instances like here in Los Angeles at We Spa.
All Amala has is an anecdote. She doesn't have any empirical data because the empirical data disproves everything she's saying. I mean, I could bring up anecdotes of cis women assaulting other cis women. Does that mean that there is an epidemic of cis women that need to be barred from bathrooms? No, that just means that there's a handful of creeps and weirdos out there. You can point to this with any group of people.
But we cannot blame trans people for that. And
Nobody's blaming you.
That's the problem right here.
Even if you allow trans women into women's bathrooms, if they commit a crime, it's still a crime, regardless of their gender identity, and you can persecute them for it. So it doesn't open up the door anymore to like any kind of crime or privacy violations. And the empirical data backs us up that it does not increase privacy violations. It does not increase assaults in bathrooms.
When you walk into the bathroom, I'm not interested in knowing what you are, what you identify as. I'm trying to use the bathroom and leave out of there. What people have tried to say is that when trans women go into the bathrooms, they're being predatory, and that is not the case. That is something we do not blame on trans women. Although you were not saying that, when we talk about predatory behavior and when we talk about like the predatory cases, none of them have been trans women. So I just want to make sure, I know she's not strictly doing that, but because she said that, I think it's very important that I bring that out on the table and discuss that.
We have to have the conversation, and I'll open up the question. We know that if this legislation happens, if we move forward with this move, there are going to be men who take advantage of it.
The empirical data disproves that, Amala. Like, here's the thing. You need to challenge her on the empirical data because she's wrong about the empirical data. That completely debunks her entire argument.
More important than the female women that will be victimized by this.
Who said female women will be victimized by this?
They will, and they have.
No, you're only assuming, but the reality of it is, again, when people are going into the restroom, when people are only going into the restroom, they're only focused on doing one or two things, and that's using the restroom.
Yeah,
But you didn't answer the question. Is your comfort more important than the female people who could be victimized by this?
Okay, so let me help her answer the question. Which one do you think I'm going to get the shit kicked out of me in? It wasn't the women's restroom. The issue that you're bringing up, first of all, is already violating a whole bunch of laws. Okay, if somebody's exposing themselves in a bathroom, that's a whole different environment rather than just letting trans people in. In California, it's right now 100% legal for trans people to go use the bathroom of their choice. So I don't know what law you're talking about.
You're asking this question as if I would not stand up for cis women that were in the restroom, and that's not the case. Nice dodge there. But
dodging.
The reality of it is, one thing I'm noticing is we're reducing a lot of these particular conversations to genitalia. And it's not about genitalia, it's about safety.
Yeah, her concern is the possibility of predation, and that's still a probability. It doesn't matter if trans people are using the restroom or not. Sure. But what you're concerned about is that you're possibly that people feel more emboldened to put on women's clothes and go into the bathroom. But they're still violating the law all over the place if that's the purpose that they're going in for.
Entire conversation they just had relies on an assumption that allowing trans people into women's bathrooms is going to increase like the rates at which women experience privacy violations, assaults. But the empirical data completely debunks all of that. Like, that entire conversation can just be completely ended by just pointing out, well, actually, we have empirical data on the amounts of assaults and privacy violations that happen in women's bathrooms before and after trans-inclusive policies are adopted across many states. There is no statistically significant difference in the assaults, in the privacy violations in those bathrooms after adopting trans-inclusive policies. So this premise that, more women are going to be harmed is just completely false. The empirical data does not back that up at all. So there's no concern there. We're all good. We can protect trans women and cis women, and I want to protect everybody.
Yeah, so I didn't step forward because, and I know in today's age this is going to sound very radical, and but I don't agree with the whole transgender ideology, and so for me it's encouraging something that is based in what I feel is delusion.
I really hope they challenge her on, what do you mean by delusional? Do trans people have a false belief about themselves? No, they don't. They just have a different definition of what woman is. If you believe that woman is like a biological category defined by chromosomes or ovaries or whatever, that's okay. But if I have a different definition that woman is a social category, then am I delusional for thinking that like somebody who meets the social category of woman is a woman? I'm not delusional, I'm just applying a different definition of woman. Delusion requires a false belief. There is no false belief. Trans women are aware they don't have ovaries. Trans women are aware that they typically have XY chromosomes. There is no false belief about themselves. They just have a different definition of womanhood. That's not a delusion, that's just a disagreement. I think it's also very telling when people make this argument that anybody who disagrees with them on a definitional level is just completely delusional. That's a ridiculous claim to make at all. There are certain contexts where we use certain words in different situations. Like, we can talk about race as a political category versus a social category versus like biological markers that are correlated with race. And if somebody's using race in like a different definition than the way that you're using race, are they being delusional? No, they're just using a word in a different way than you are. That's not the same thing as a delusion, and trying to say that they're delusional actually shows that you are the one who is closed-minded and who cannot accept that words can mean different things in different contexts. It's rather telling when people try to go down that line.
I think that if that's the case, that to some extent all gender is delusion. If we're looking at historically anywhere from, midwives after the enclosure of the commons in the 1400s, having their whole trade affected, or Brewsters having their trade affected, and now we don't think of women as, Brewsters, or that creating beer is a womanly thing. These all came from social conditions. These all came, a lot of gender, regardless of biological sex, it didn't like naturally flow out of our genitals, and like it was like, we're like, this is how my genitals are, so this is like how my gender is going to be. That didn't happen. That's not life. Like a lot of people who are either transgender or who are LGBT in general, all my friends were girls. At first, I just remember there were a lot of things where like I would kind of like come up against people telling me that that's wrong, like that whether it's something I like, something I want to do. It wasn't until kindergarten that like someone told me that I'm a boy, and I was like, oh, I don't feel comfortable going to any bathroom in this world, like in the current society we live in. And to make trans women the whipping girls of that, I think that's disingenuous, but I do think that we need a systemic change to make ourselves safer. I don't really know anyone who doesn't feel a little bit uncomfortable going to the bathroom.
And trans people are not a delusion. Let's make it very clear. We're here. We've been here for ages. We've been here since the beginning of time. We're in your history books. And I think it's very disingenuous to say that a whole identity is a delusion.
She's not appropriately challenging the premise. This is something that I'm noticing a lot here. You can attack the argument without attacking it at the correct point. She is correct that being trans is not a delusion, but you have to point out that it's wrong at the level of the premise. A delusion specifically requires a false belief. What is the false belief that trans people have about themselves? Is their belief that gender is a social category false? Is their belief that their biological sex characteristics are this and that false? Trans people are aware of what their biology is. You have to attack this claim at the premise, not at the argument level.
You feel like women. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there is an objective truth, and I don't believe in his truth, her truth, their truth, my truth. Like, there is truth, and
Who defined that truth?
and like it's already defined. And I, as a Christian, I believe God is the one who set truth.
But who defined that?
Is the truth.
Can you tell me who defined that?
God.
When God defined gender, and like God said that you can transition to being a eunuch, so like being transgender is okay, is that a delusion, or is that okay? I would really be interested to see how she responds to the eunuch line of questioning. Gosh, I wish I was here on this panel.
I couldn't talk to my dad, my siblings, because ultimately I felt like it wasn't going to lead to anything, because there wasn't a lot of education in the cis community like there is in the trans and non-binary community. We're talking about a book that was written by man with his own bias.
Who created chromosomes?
Yeah, I'm personally not religious, and I believe in science.
When we talk about chromosomes, it goes back to the conversation we were talking about earlier about being intersex.
No, okay, because she brought up chromosomes, this is the perfect time to debunk the premise of trans people are delusional. If trans people are delusional, then they would have to have a false belief that they have XX chromosomes. Hey, my fellow trans women, do you believe that you have XX chromosomes? No. Oh, look at that. None of us believe that we have XX chromosomes. Rather, we recognize that our society makes a social distinction of gender, not strictly a biological one, and we can meet that social category of womanhood. That is the perfect opportunity to point out, if there was a delusion, then we would have false beliefs about our chromosomes, but obviously we're all aware of our chromosomes, and we consider ourselves women because we just understand this social categorization of gender. We understand that sex and gender are not the same thing. That's not a delusion, that's having a basic understanding of sociology.
Talking about intersex, we're talking about people who were born as a male and they try to transition. The whole fact that they're trying to transition into a female in the first place shows that they aren't actually that, or else there would be no need to transition, right?
That completely debunks her entire point that trans people are delusional. Like, she's making the claim that trans people are, like, delusional about their gender, which means the same thing as sex to her. If trans people were delusional about their sex and they believed that they were the exact same thing as a cis female, then why would they medically transition? If I was delusional and thought that, oh, I was born in a body that's identical to that of a cis female, why would I medically transition? If I had a false belief about myself, there'd be no reason to transition. But trans people don't have a false belief about themselves. They recognize what their body is currently like, and they just would like to change that.
What is that? What does that feel like?
Yeah, how does
And
anyone
how do you know?
I'm not saying I feel like a woman. I am a woman.
So then why did you transition? Why can't you just present as a man but be a woman?
I transitioned so I could be who I was. I did not feel like I was the person that I identified with when I was born. So I took the steps to align my outside body with how I feel on the inside. What makes you stand up every day and make you identify as a woman? Let me challenge you on that.
I am a woman, and I don't like being called a cis woman because I'm not a cis woman. I'm a woman. I'm not a birthing person. I'm a mother.
So get mad at the terminology, not at trans people.
It's your new terminology.
But this is what I notice a lot of cis women do. The terminology has been around for so long. Cis is a prefix. Cis means same. Instead of getting mad at trans and non-binary people for using updated terminology, get mad at Webster. You're not going along with the times and being educated on the different pronouns and the different identities.
You have to admit, some of the pronouns are kind of ridiculous. I mean, to be, with all due respect, I mean, I'm sure you have to agree some of the pronouns that
I don't
people
think
use.
they're ridiculous. I think they're very expansive. Trans and non-binary people just want you to respect their chosen pronoun. We are not trying to force pronouns on you. Just understand that the terminology is going to continue to grow. If you're willing to educate yourself and understand, then you've got it.
I think she did a good job at addressing, yeah, terminology changes all the time. Maybe this might not be the right group for it. I think it'd also be an interesting line of questioning to go, I'm not trans, I'm just a woman. Don't call me a trans woman. We recognize that there are contexts where it's useful to distinguish cis from trans, and that's why it's good to have those words to do so. But I have claim to womanhood the same way that you do.
The ability to give birth is a woman's greatest strength. Can the disagreeer step forward?
I'm not able to have children. So I'm still strong. I'm funny. I'm physically strong. I'm smart, and I have a lot of strength. I don't believe that having a baby is the greatest strength, because not all of us can. I cannot have kids due to medical issues from a medical procedure that I had when I was younger. And it's a hard subject to talk about. It doesn't mean I'm any less of a woman, but can we get another question? I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
One of the things that I regret was the fact that I would never be able to do that, but I was honored in the ability to participate it from the other side. Women are amazing. They don't just deal with that, so.
While giving birth is not a woman's greatest strength, I do think that only biological women are capable of going through that process and bringing life into the world.
I need to push back on that because we're also forgetting that trans men and trans masculine people can also give birth as well. And I don't think it's fair to just set it on one group that says that just biological women have that power to just give birth. And we have to be very clear when we look at the nuances of birth.
I recognize that there are people who have different identities. There are biological women who identify as men and then go on to give birth. I would argue, however, that those people are still biological women. And I know that is something that can offend many, but that stands as my belief.
We need to bring back the term transsexual. When you say that trans men are like biological women, you would be misrepresenting a lot of their biology. People who are biologically female are not roided on testosterone. There are some sex characteristics that would be more in line with females for these transsexual males, but they will also have lots of sex characteristics that are completely different than your average typical female. And that's why it's very useful to bring back the term transsexual to refer to this person. It's honestly the best compromise even. It's more accurate and inclusive. I think that bringing back the term transsexual to refer to people who medically transition is a great idea, honestly.
I just really wish that we would kind of be a little bit more mutable to the terminology, because I think that's what really is going to open up that dialogue and that discussion.
If I may, I think the crux of the conversation kind of comes back to, are trans women women? And I think if we don't agree there, it's going to be very difficult to kind of keep the conversation going or even agree on the points that you guys are talking about, because if we don't believe that trans women are women, then the conversation kind of ends there in terms of whether they're like men can give birth or not, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure that's the case. I feel like the ability to give birth is not like the end all be all of a woman's like meaning and life and herself and her personality. And I think that if you can acknowledge that, I would also then maybe challenge the idea that womanhood, as opposed to like a female sex, like womanhood is a consistent thing that has always been one way.
So how would you define womanhood?
You sound like Matt Walsh.
It's a good question.
Womanhood, to me, is about standing in integrity. It is about being confident in who you are. And me, as a Black trans woman, should not be a threat to you. And what I see from a lot of cisgender women is they're trying to deem what womanhood is supposed to look like. I have my own perspective of womanhood. We can coexist in the same world, but the reality is we get so stuck on parts. Having a vagina is not the only thing that makes you a woman. I'm sorry. It takes integrity, it takes courage, it takes lifting other women up. It takes those things to begin to define womanhood, and there's so many other different things.
The definition of womanhood she provided was amalgamous. Probably the best way to approach this question is there are lots of ways that we can define womanhood, and I think they're all valid in their own right. We can talk about womanhood in terms of a social category, people who are expected by society to behave femininely or to perform femininely. We can talk about people who actually engage in those actions of femininity. We can think about womanhood in terms of a psychological state. I think there's validity in recognizing gender as this performative social phenomenon. I think there's a validity in recognizing gender as the social phenomenon that is thrust upon us, whether or not we fulfill it. And there's also the category of biological sex, obviously. I think that all of these things can tie into womanhood, but it's wrong to exclude certain people from womanhood just because they might not have the same monolithic experience of womanhood that you did. There are lots of reasons why people consider themselves women, be it that's how I experience society, be it, well, I was kind of born that way and I'm okay with that, be it I went through this process of transitioning, be it I stand in sisterhood with my fellow women, be it I have patriarchy oppressing me. There are so many different reasons why people are women.
Okay, so if I were a white person and I said Blackness is about integrity and courage and kind of the same thing that you used to define womanhood, and then I said I want to transition into a Black person and I'm white. And I'm redefining what Blackness is to fit what I view it as, right? There's no objective reality of what Blackness is. Would you consider that appropriation, or do you think that's something I should be allowed to do?
I consider that dodging, and I consider that comparing apples to oranges, because race and gender identity are two separate different things. When we look at race, we have to look at many, many different structures of what whiteness and white supremacy looks like, and how white supremacy can be manipulated into other things. And what happens is the closer you are in proximity to whiteness, you're able to weaponize it against other people. It reminds me a lot of Rachel Dolezal, who, masqueraded as a Black woman. It really did open up many more doors of conversations around it, but it's still wrong. It's still not fair, because she will still ultimately have a privilege that I, as a Black trans woman, would not begin to have.
What's interesting is that we're talking about race and gender, or as we probably like to call it on our side, sex. Race actually has a more understandable structure for people being transracial. Race does actually exist on a spectrum. I'm biracial. Many perceive me to be Black, even though I am also half white and half Black. We label people like President Obama as a Black president, even though he is as well. Race has never had binary markers. It does exist on a spectrum. Gender, however, does have binary markers. As much as we try, as much as we change the way that we self-present, chromosomes are not going to change.
Does she think that chromosomes are a binary marker? There's single X, triple X, XXY, XYY, XXYY. even people that have different sex chromosomes across different cells of their very body.
That's just a reality.
All right, I'm going to bring up a little point here because you talked about the binary side of gender. Well, I was born a little of both. I believe I've never had my chromosomes checked, but since I fathered 2 children, I'm assuming I have the correct male chromosomes. So I was intersexed, and there's a lot of reasons that happens, none of which are well studied or understood, but a friend of mine in the pediatric trauma world says about 1 in 150 kids come out with some degree of ambiguity in their gender. For me, that appeared as always feeling out of place. And for the first week of my life, I was in the surgical wards at Naval Hospital in San Diego getting pieces of me cut off. So, and then they gave me testosterone for the first 11 years of my life. I wish the world were truly sexually binary. It would make it so much easier. But there is a little bit of a smear. And, as a trans person, I'm a very conservative trans person. I don't see the huge gender spectrum that a lot of people in the trans community do. Do I feel better having transitioned? Yes, absolutely. I used to live in a little shell, very large shell, but now I'm much more open about who I am. Is that the only thing that generally defines a woman? No, I don't think that is the only thing that generally defines a woman.
Right. I think there are a lot of women who may be on our side of the argument who will try to maybe invalidate your experiences by saying you can't give birth or you can't have a period. And while those things may be true, I'm sure there's a lot of other different struggles that you all are going through. And I would truly believe that you probably are highly discriminated against in our society, and it is hard to be you. It is hard to go through the things that you go through and have to deal with some of the responses that you get from people. And it's not a struggle that I would wish on myself at all.
Not a struggle I wish on my worst enemy.
Trans women should be allowed to compete in women's sports.
I do think that trans women have every right to compete in women's sports.
I'm just worried that this conversation is going to go off the rails.
Our own hormones, the hormones break their body down. Having gender affirming surgery breaks down the body. And so I think we really need to be educated before we jump to a conclusion that trans women are stronger than cis women in sports. Hi, everybody.
I find it interesting that you assume the people who disagree with you are uneducated, and I will speak out against that. I think the research shows that trans women do happen to have a biological advantage against biological women. Even though you are taking hormones, and that does start to change your body and level things out, we're talking about primarily people who have transitioned post-puberty, which means they do have male bone density, male wingspan, male hand size, feet size, lung capacity. All of these things are going against women.
Some of the things she said was not true. Your bone density does change when you take HRT, and even some things related to like hand size, feet size, like a lot of these things do shift around a bit. Now, yes, it is true that if you went through like a male puberty, there are some things that will be kind of left over. We have to really examine the edge cases. Most sports allow people who were born female, who have been doping on testosterone for years even, to go off of that testosterone, and then after being off testosterone for a couple of years, being back on estrogen, they can compete in women's sports again. That seems to typically be what we allow. Those kinds of women, the ex-doping women, will be in a position pretty similar to where trans women are at. It's also something that matters a lot more on like a sport by sport basis. Obviously with like a medical transition later in life, there are some parameters that are going to change a lot more than others. And for a sport like swimming, all the parameters that change are going to bring you basically completely in line with a cis female. Meanwhile, sports like contact sports, those are going to have more markers that can be harder to change. Broadly speaking, I hate that this conversation is politicized, because what this conversation needs to be is it needs to be sports medicine scientists figuring out what is the best thing we can do to come up with policies that, to the best extent as possible, are as fair and inclusive as they can be. And there's no such thing as a perfect solution that exists, but I just would hate for politics to get in the way of sports medicine scientists doing the best research that is possible. Yeah, and then there's also interesting cases. If a trans person has gone onto puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones such that they never went through a male puberty, there's no reason why they should be excluded from female sports, because they will be completely in line with females. And then there's also things like esports, like chess. People have tried to exclude trans women from competitions like these, and it's like, what is the biological advantage that a trans person has over a cis person in esports or in chess? If you're getting to that point, you have to just be transphobic and misogynistic. Like, you have to be both of those things in order to make that argument. It gets crazy how much people politicize this conversation.
I don't think you have to have a direct relationship to sports to realize that women are being affected by this issue, and I do reject the idea of equity. There is no way to come about an equality of outcome, which is what equity is saying. There's a reason that women's sports are less funded and less watched than men's sports.
There are real issues that women's sports face, things like lack of funding. Also, predatory coaches is a huge issue that women's sports faces. I wish that these were the kind of issues that were more so brought to the mainstream, because these are things that, like, we need broader social change, we need broader action on. With the trans people in sports, this is something that we need more science on. Politicization is not the best tool for getting more science into a topic, but politicization is good for bringing more funding into a topic, for bringing more advocacy, especially for people that are victimized by predatory coaches. These are real issues that women's sports face, ones that can be much more so better addressed through policy and through social activism.
We now exist on a slippery slope. If it's female sports, is it then female locker rooms? Is it then female prisons, which we're now seeing becoming an issue here in California, where biological male inmates are being put in female facilities because they identify as women? We have to discuss as a society.
If only there were any kind of data, which we would have on this topic, to show whether or not there are harms in doing this. And we actually do have data on this. The data shows that when you put trans women in men's facilities, they are victimized and assaulted at extreme disproportionate rates. However, when you put trans women in women's facilities, the rates of victimization are the same. Like, they're at the same base level. So it is a harms reduction overall for everyone to put trans people in these spaces of the gender they identify with. And you can certainly have legal systems in place to suss out people that are trying to weaponize a disingenuously claimed identity, especially for something like prison. I think that requiring some kind of, like, transition in order to access, like, a certain prison space to stop people from, as soon as they're in the courtroom, just, like, suddenly identifying as trans disingenuously to, like, get into a certain prison. You can certainly have systems in place to stop that kind of thing, but we really need to focus on the empirical data. Amala is never going to break up any empirical data because all the empirical data we have completely debunks everything she's insinuating.
How much we give into the feelings of wanting everybody to be accepted, and how much we are willing to do that at the expense of biological women.
I use myself as an example. This is about how big I was in junior high school and early high school. I used to be able to walk up to a V8 engine block, pick it up off the floor and set it on a table. And if I was in powerlifting or weightlifting, that amount of, that advantage was just unbelievable. I've been on hormones for 15 years. Did it weaken me? Absolutely. Did my bone density really hasn't changed, my muscular hasn't changed. And this is not a binary question. There's a lot of nuances involved.
Bone density and muscle mass absolutely change in response to hormones. You can look at any study that will show you that.
I just want to ask a question for what you were saying. Can you throw out some statistics?
I don't think you need to have so there's an abundance of research. There's even trans activists who agree with exactly what I'm saying.
I don't think it's wrong to ask that, like, if you're going to be on a panel and speaking about these issues, that you should, maybe have, like, at least a ballpark of some of the numbers. I don't think it's an unreasonable ask at all. This is a very sussy deflection from Amala. Amala should have done her research. She really should have.
Even she just spoke to the fact that her bone density did not change.
Yeah.
Hormones literally change your bone density. This is a well-known studied fact. Hormones literally change your bone structure, especially if you start early enough. Hormones absolutely change your bones and muscle. And then Amala's like, I don't have to provide data because this woman lied for me. This is the kind of shit you get on Jubilee. Okay, that's a fair point, Cody. I would agree that lies do require intent to deceive. Gail is not trying to deceive people. She is just misinformed about hormones. Yeah, thank you for correcting me on that. You're totally right, Cody.
And we can see it in sports as we're watching them. Leah Thomas is a great example.
So if you can't throw out the statistics, we're not doing enough of the work. And let's also be clear, there are some cisgender women who produce high levels of testosterone as well. And so we really have to unpack it from all different sides here.
Can you produce statistics about the bone density of biological biological men and how it changes upon being on hormones and whether or not it levels out to biological women?
I actually cannot, because when I would think of those statistics, I would think it was BS, to be quite honest with you, because the reality of it is we could talk about statistics and the research all day long, but it's about experience. We're going to be looking more at the experience because, again,
I think that she should also be able to hopefully ballpark some numbers. I mean, especially if she's going to go down the route of challenging Amala on like empirical data. I think that she should have some empirical data herself, but Amala like throwing the question back at her that she wasn't able to answer, it's a little bit bad faith.
when we look at cisgender women who produce high levels of testosterone and who have been kicked out of sports and been disqualified from teams based on something that they biologically cannot control, then what are we really talking about here?
Well, we're talking about, data and that is overwhelming, and we're talking about what is also we're capable of seeing with our human eyes. I think it's very clear that if you compare maybe you to the rest of us, there is going to be a strength difference. There's going to be a bone
don't know
density
that.
difference.
But do you think that there would be a strength difference and a bone density difference between all of the women here and Brittany Griner? Because there absolutely would. Yet Brittany Griner is a cisgender woman. The line of questioning of, oh, is there a difference between you and me? I think that's a really terrible line of questioning if you think about it, because if you look at any kind of female athlete, especially a female athlete who is very tall and strong like Brittany Griner, her strength parameters and such are probably going to be much stronger than all of the trans women in that room.
Just perceiving and assuming just because I look a certain way, that's not fair. Me, her we could look completely different or whatever, but she may be stronger than me.
I agree, but
she have much more agility and vitality than I do. We don't know that until you actually do it.
I'm
until
saying
you
it
actually
has been
experience it.
studied, it's been done.
And it's been done, we've seen it numerous
But it's an
times,
assumption.
time again.
But we're only going on assumption at this point. Because again,
It's not assumption when we see it.
I think it'd also be really interesting if they brought up the point that, it was also studied that Black women, on average, have higher bone density than white women. Should we exclude Black women from women's sports because of their increased bone density? With these kind of parameters, there's going to be a lot of nuance and there's going to be a lot of edge cases and like kind of figuring out the parameter tuning of like at what point is an average threshold difference fair versus unfair is really hard to do, especially if you're not somebody that has a sports medicine science background.
Maybe it's the news cycle that I watch, but I see it a lot. I see it quite often where they're showing trans women beating. I'm by far.
And you don't see women
Biological
dominating in the men's sports, right? You don't see trans men going into men's sport and just completely dominating and wiping the field with them. This is what happens when you, in my opinion, twist God's design.
Oh my gosh. There is no trans woman that is consistently dominating any female sport. Trans women have been allowed to compete in the female category in the Olympics for more than 2 decades, and a trans woman has never placed a single medal in any of the Olympic events ever. If there was a trans woman dominating, you'd expect them to at least get like an Olympic medal over the course of like 20 years. If trans women were dominating, you'd be able to point to a sport where there's a trans woman who like consistently is destroying all the other women and breaking records, but that's just not happening. That's just a false narrative.
Go against God's design. You create these problems that you wouldn't have if you weren't going against what God intended.
I'm going to take her side a little bit on that. And let me say one more thing, and I'm supporting you on this one. There's a great deal of women that, and actually there was a lady in the last Olympics that they actually disqualified until she went on androgen blockers to knock her testosterone down to a female level. Like I said, this is not a binary yes or no question. And the whole idea of messing with what, God puts up, God put me up, okay, if you want to take that. And I had this conversation with a very religious man in San Diego, and he was like, oh, I don't quite know how to deal with that.
And God made you that way, but he didn't make a lot of the people transitioning.
I understand.
No, but
male
God also
or
understands my transition. God, first of all, knew what I was going to be in my life. God already knew I was going to be trans when God put me here. So I
why
don't think
didn't
it's
he make
fair.
you
I don't think it's fair when
female?
people dip and dab. Your relationship with God is personal.
Yes.
It's sacred.
Let's
and
keep
I
it
don't
there.
think it's fair when other people dib and dab in other people's relationship with God when they don't understand what they go through. God still blesses me as a trans woman. God blesses you as a cisgender woman. God is embodied in me as a trans person. I don't think it's fair, again, when we judge people's personal relationship with God. Gender identity, sexual orientation, none of that matters to a God that loves all.
I think there actually is a good religious argument for saying God made you trans, if that's what you believe. God made you who you are in the womb. He set all those things in place. We have scientific evidence which shows that there are genetic factors, there are hormonal factors that happen in the womb that are strongly related to this process of trans identity. If God is responsible for your creation in the womb, then he would also be responsible for those genetic factors, those hormonal factors, which seem to be big factors in what makes people trans.
Gender dysphoria is real.
I think it is obviously real because many people experience it, but like any kind of dysphoria, whether it's someone who thinks they're overweight or anything, I think it should be treated as not reality. Like if I thought I was obese.
She's conflating dysphoria with dysmorphia here. So dysmorphia is a delusion where you have a false belief about your physical body. Like body dysmorphia is like having an actual false perception about your body, like you think that your body is fatter than it actually is. But dysphoria is just kind of like a discomfort. So a discomfort is not a delusion, but a dysmorphia is a delusion. So a discomfort is, I recognize what my body is actually like, and I'm uncomfortable with that. That's dysphoria. Meanwhile, dysmorphia is, I have a false belief about what my body is like. For dysmorphia, things like antipsychotic medications and delusion-correcting therapy is what treats that. For dysphoria, it tends to be the case that self-improvement and changing your body to be how you want to be through personal training, things like that, it tends to what treats forms of dysphoria.
Affirming therapists to tell me, yes, you are obese and you should, get skinnier.
Well, I had the opportunity of working on the DSM-4, I think it was, when we actually declassified transgender dysphoria from a mental illness to a condition. I had been, at that point in time, I'd been cross-dressing for 50 years. And, because that dysphoria was there and every single thing I did to try to drive it away didn't work. I spent millions of dollars trying to be the coolest dude in the world. I bought airplanes, I bought everything that I could to just show the world how masculine I was. It didn't work. It didn't go away. And I did therapy. I purposely went to a therapist that was anti-gender affirming. And literally he said, you need to do this.
She put herself through conversion therapy because she didn't want to be trans. That makes a really big statement about how shitty it is to be marginalized and ostracized by society for being trans. This girl put herself through conversion therapy because she didn't want to be trans. It's like the Pray the Gay Away movement. These people suffer so much because society tells them that they're not supposed to be the way that they ought to be, and they put themselves through these horrible situations, through what is literally a form of psychological abuse, just to try to fit in with what society wants, and that's so sad.
He asked two very fundamental questions. The most important one was, it's got to be truly exhausting for you to lead two lives. And I was kind of like, that kind of shook me to the core that my 22-year-old son saw that better than I did. So shortly thereafter, I announced to my family that I was going to transition. My wife and I separated because of it. The kids were not necessarily shocked, but understood and have supported me quite well. And my wife has actually become a very good, very warm, supporting person for me.
I really hope that they bring up the argument that cis people also experience gender dysphoria. Things like breast augmentations, the things like plastic surgeries that cis women get, even hormone deficiency treatments. These are all forms of gender-affirming treatment for cis people to alleviate the kinds of gender dysphoria that cis people experience. Hair transplants in men. There are so many examples of gender dysphorias that cis people experience and gender-affirming treatments that cis people undergo to treat that.
Dysphoria almost made me kill myself. And coming from Mississippi, at the time, there wasn't a lot of access to gender-affirming resources, like hormones, if I wanted surgery, whatever the case may be. And a lot of us trans folks who don't have access like that, a lot of us have to do sex work to be able to afford some of these things as well. Me coming up at the age of 20, and I knew I had a serious gender dysphoria, I did things to my body that I should have went to a hospital to do. That is something that's very, very hard for people to understand. A lot of us commit suicide because of gender dysphoria, and so it hits our community a lot harder.
I do think gender dysphoria is very much real. I think the issue that's happened, especially in the space of science and research, is that we've looked at gender dysphoria and said the only source of care that we can go through is blind gender affirmation care. And a lot of the research shows that this is not the route to go into.
What's the other route, Amala? Are you saying that conversion therapy has better results than gender-affirming treatment? Because that's completely false.
Do nonpartisan research. Sweden, Finland have decided that yes, gender affirmation care should be an option, but it really should be the last resort when it comes to treating people who appear at clinics with gender dysphoria. You know, a lot of conservatives will deny and say, well, gender affirmation care does not make them happier. And in many cases, that is true. But there are the cases like yourselves where the gender affirmation care does make them happier.
So what's the alternative? Is she just saying that kids that experience gender dysphoria, gender incongruence should like get gender therapy first? Because that's already the world we live in. Like that's literally already how the system works. To go on puberty blockers, a completely reversible step, a teenager has to go through at least 6 months of gender therapy and receive doctor's letters in order to get puberty blockers, a completely reversible step under the WPATH standards. This idea that a kid just like goes to a doctor and they're like, give me puberty blockers, please. They're not just like, yes, thank you for coming to us. You are definitely trans and would benefit from puberty blockers. Here, start taking them right away. The world that Amal is suggesting where there should be screening, where there should be systems in place to determine who is trans and who would actually benefit from this treatment, that's the world we live in right now.
You know, I know a lot of people that have transitioned, have untransitioned. I've talked with a gentleman at a religious right convention one day, and he was sitting there screaming how Jesus got him out of his gender transition. And honestly, that was the saddest man I've ever talked to in my life. When I looked at him straight in the eyes and I said, you know, here, I don't agree with what you say, but I 100% support your right to say that. And he just literally broke down crying on the steps of the Supreme Court.
If I could interject really quickly, I do.
No, absolutely not.
I feel as though the medical profession is actually inching towards a space that is going to become unsafe for people who try to express their gender dysphoria, because now we have young children coming into clinics expressing this, who by and large, statistically, about 60 to 70% grow out of that dysphoria.
No, wrong. She is misciting persistence-desistance studies. These persistent-desistance studies specifically assess people that come into a gender clinic with any form of gender incongruence, which essentially ranges from trans people to just gender nonconforming kids that talk to a gender therapist to help them through their gender nonconformity and to figure out how to express themselves and how to better accept themselves. So it is true that most gender clinics and most gender therapists, the majority of the patients they see are gender nonconforming cis kids. The fact that these studies show that most of the people going to gender clinics aren't trans, that shows that the systems in place are working for figuring out who's trans and who isn't. This 60 to 70%, this isn't people that like went on cross-sex hormones and are now detransitioning and regretting it. It's people that talk to a gender therapist. The systems in place help them realize, I'm just gender nonconforming. I'm okay with that. That's who I want to be. That's who I am. And they accept it and move on and live happy, healthy lives. That's that 60 to 70% that she's referring to. It actually shows that the screening processes we have in place are effective.
Because it's become a political issue where many activists have come in and say, no, you blindly affirm, you affirm to the furthest extent that you can, rather than going through a more comprehensive process with these children. We have what I think is a medical tragedy happening against young people in this country.
We already have this medical process in place. That's how the world is right now. If that's what you're advocating for, that's already the world we live in.
I have been sexually harassed.
So sexualized, everyone and everything, and I think we owe a lot of that to pornography and just media, and I think the kind of acceptance that I do see more so in the LGBT community of like, you know, sex is great and let like everyone talk about it and there's no shame and everyone's just blurting out, you know, the fact that we're perpetuating a culture that's frankly, in my opinion, disgusting.
Is she trying to say that sex positivity is what's creating sexual harassment? That is completely ridiculous. When sex is taught as something that is shameful, when people aren't aware and knowledgeable of consent, that's what leads to people not knowing how to approach these topics and what leads to frustrated men that don't know what to do, catcalling women. And by the way, kind of this idea that like men are the horny ones and then women are the ones that are being chased by men and that have to like stop men from pursuing them. This is very much socially constructed. In ancient Greek society, women were believed to be hornier, and it was the case that men would like turn down women because women just wanted it all the time, and like being a man, you were more likely to have easier access to sex back there. Oh my gosh, she's got the idea completely backwards. Sex positivity, consent positivity, these are the things that combat that. If you want to reduce sexual harassment, you would want to build a society that is as equitable about sex as possible, and sex positivity is what's going to achieve that. If men and women are allowed to express their sexuality and sexual desires equally, and they are not shamed for doing so, this will be the society where people are going to be able to enjoy sex in the most respectful and equitable way possible. Sex positivity absolutely brings us closer to a culture where any kind of like motivating factor of sexual harassment, be it based off of sexual frustration, that would absolutely be reduced by sex positivity. And consent positivity, which is closely associated with sex positivity, will also further work to reduce this, understanding that, hey, consent is the most important thing. You know, if you want to have these kind of interactions with people, you should get their enthusiastic consent, because that is just what's respectable and most fun and most enjoyable and what's worthwhile about this entire experience.
I'm talking more so just about this sexual revolution, that the more sexual you are, the more partners you have, the more open you are about your sex life and everything.
That's not what sex positivity is about. Sex positivity is about freeing people from shame surrounding sex. That way people can express themselves in ways that are right for them. If that means being an asexual person, sex positivity is all about you being free to do so and being free from social pressures to have sex or to not have sex. If you're somebody who is hypersexual and polyamorous and wants to do all this stuff, sex positivity is about being safe, being able to engage in this in a happy, healthy, consensual, safe way that meets everybody's desires. Sex positivity is for everyone. It's about reducing and eliminating guilt and shame surrounding sex for everyone, which helps us all.
People are coming out of the woodwork saying, you know, I was violated, this happened to me, but they like drove home with that person. And I'm not blaming them, but I am saying those lines are being blurred because of our just flagrant disregard for any kind of like actual relationship prior to the sexual encounter. And I think a lot of people are being exploited left and right.
True sex positivity has been powerful. It has helped us to grow and learn about our bodies in so many ways and learn safe sex practices in so many ways. What I would blame for rape culture or for a lack of good boundaries or that kind of thing is we live in a capitalist system that has taken things like sex positivity and mangled it and repackaged it and made it a whole other thing than what it actually is.
Conservatives' understanding of sex positivity is absolutely not what sex positivity actually is. The idea of sex positivity being like, go out there and be a slut and that'll make you happy, that's not what sex positivity is about. What sex positivity is about is being able to express your sexuality in ways that are healthy and that are fulfilling without guilt or shame. And I think that a lot of sex positivity also includes relationship positivity, that the best kind of sex that's out there is loving, enthusiastically consenting sex in a relationship where both people are happy and love each other. That's the best stuff out there, and the sex positivity movement is about encouraging people to find that and to be able to pursue that without fear of shame or guilt.
I was sexually harassed for 5 years by a woman. That does happen because I'm pretty sure it's going to be we're men this, men that. It's hard coming from a man, but to me it was harder coming from a woman because it wasn't expected. Like, I understand you're going to probably touch on that about how men are more on the predatory side or the more harassing side sometimes. But I just wanted to let you know that it does happen with women as well.
All through my life, you know, world's biggest kid in junior high school, I basically was harassed continuously for being gender non-conforming. Back then, you know, everybody in junior high school took showers together. I basically had a permanent welt on my bottom.
Sex positivity will help us actually deal with these cases of predatory women far better so than we do right now. If the sexes are viewed equally, then we wouldn't see this disparity in how we view sexual assault by women versus men differently. We would view it as the same if we view sex between them as the same. You know, have you ever seen like a news article where it's like a teacher sexually assaults a student, The way that the article is written is so different if the teacher is a man versus if the teacher's a woman. If it's a man, like, the news is quick to demonize this person to no end. But if it's a woman teacher that does this, then the media's like, oh, look at how this teacher had sex with a lucky boy. That's also horrible. Like, you should be condemning this person just as much. I do not think it's okay for teachers to have sex with students, particularly underage students. Like, the media's like, look at this lucky 16-year-old that got with his teacher. That's literally statutory rape. The way that media approaches this is so different, and it makes it so hard to handle these abuse cases when they're viewed so unequally. And sex positivity and equaling the playing field of the sexes would do so much to get rid of that different stigma and make the situation more so able that we can meaningfully address this from both sides.
From people snapping towels at me because, I wasn't as well endowed as I probably should be. I had, pretty good sized boy boobs and basically was just unhappy being in sports. But, it happens everywhere. I have been sexually assaulted and it didn't work out well for any of them. It's real. Let me just put it that way. It's absolutely real.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard to find a person who hasn't been sexually harassed in some way, shape, or form, whether you are male or female. I think it's an experience that we all share because we are in somewhat of a hyper-sexualized society, and people love to make those comments public. I am a podcaster and I do social media for a living, so as you can imagine, the onslaught of sexual harassment is quite vast.
From a very young age, I've had this recurring nightmare of something happening to me, trying to warn people, and no one believes me. When you're not believed that you're a desirable person, and I really don't think rape has anything to do with desire, but when you're not believed in that way, when trans women are experiencing trans misogyny, we're the ones who are least believed when we are sexually assaulted. And it just feels so disempowering and so terrifying when you know that you are someone who is seen as hypersexual, as inherently sexual, as inherently predatory, and yet at the same time you're seen as someone who can be isolated and sexually assaulted and not believed.
Absolutely. When you have these differential views of sex between different types of people, and this even affects like trans people worse than it does cis men, with how much trans women are sexualized, more so than even cis men, this disproportionately affects how we view sexual harassment and sexual abuse surrounding these people. Sex positivity and leveling the playing field, that is the best thing we can do to approach these situations fairly. It's just so awful that how much we assume things differently based off of somebody's sex and gender and whether or not they're trans. And I mean, even like race plays a role in how we view these things, and it's all very gross. Like we want to level the playing field, and if we eliminate shame and preconceptions about people like this, like that is the best thing we can do to make this as fair and increase the ability for fair justice even.
I think oftentimes when we're talking from a conservative perspective, it gets misconstrued as viewing you as a threat, and I hope that that never comes off. And I think that allegations of sexual assault, regardless of who they're coming from, should be taken seriously.
We found common ground.
I think we agreed on something.
We found common ground.
This is another rhetorical technique that you'll see the center-right, like Amala types do, where sometimes they will make the correct ought claim, where it's like, yeah, in the perfect society, you know, we ought to treat these things equally, and we have to evaluate them from an equal ground. But then the policy question is, how do we change society, or how do we implement policy to get there? And so you can have somebody who makes the correct ought claim, but who's going to do nothing about the societal change, who's going to be nothing about the policy. They get to get their brownie points from both sides because they look like, look, I'm saying we should do the thing we should do. That makes the more like moderate left people be like, oh, okay, look, we agree, whatever. And then in reality, they're just going to do nothing, and the problems are still going to persist, and that's what the right needs to win, because the right's trying to maintain status quo and to take away rights. That was an interesting video. I wish I could have been on that panel.